Hey, it's good to see you guys this morning. My name is Hunter. I'm one of the pastors here, and it is great to have you with us. A special welcome to those of you who are new, and for those of you that will be at the membership class on Saturday, look forward to meeting and getting to know you better. We have a special group of people here who have really shared responsibility for the health of our church and for the mission of our church. We call them members, and we are very thankful for our members who really make this place go. And so if you're thinking about coming on board as a member, we are excited about that and look forward to getting to know you better this Saturday. We're going to begin a time of teaching, so if you have a Bible, you can grab it and meet me in Romans chapter 13. And if you don't have a Bible, I've got two options for you. There is, first of all, bunches of Bibles in the clouds, and you can Google Romans 13, and it will just put it on the screen of your smartphone, and we will assume, if you're looking at a screen, we will just assume you're reading a digital Bible. That's kind of how we work here. Or if you like older technology, we also have printed Bibles at the ends of your row, bound in paper, and you can have someone pass that down to you and locate the book of Romans. You'll find Romans in the New Testament. It comes right after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are called Gospels. Those are accounts of the life and the teaching and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Then there's a book called Acts, A-C-T-S, which is about the birth and the expansion of the Jesus movement as it kind of grew throughout the Greco-Roman world. And then comes a series of letters that were written to the early churches. The first one we have listed there is the letter written by Paul the Apostle to the church in Rome, hence the title Romans. And we have been going through this for several months now. We've learned that the first 11 chapters of this letter, Paul lays out in fairly exhaustive detail, in fact, more detailed than anywhere else in the New Testament. He lays out what Jesus accomplished through his life and his death and his resurrection, and then what it means to believe in him and what you receive if you are united to him by faith. That's Paul's language. If you believe in Jesus, if you trust him with your life, then you are joined to him. You're united to him in a living union where what is his flows to you. And so Paul just describes what those things are that flow to you in Romans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And so that we spent a good deal of time there. And then we learned that in the last part of this book, chapters 12 to 15, really, Paul shows us how this gospel of Jesus makes a difference in the real issues of life that we all deal with day in, day out. Last week, we learned about how it makes a difference when you are hurt by other people. And so we talked through that last week. This week we're going to learn how it makes a difference in how we relate to the governing authorities in the city and the state and the nation in which we live. And so we're calling this section the gospel in real life. That flows roughly chapters 12 to 15. And then in chapter 16, Paul just says hi to a bunch of people. And we will breeze really quickly past that. So if you're looking at this going, this is going to take forever to get through, don't worry, because the last chapter is really nothing more than saying hi to a bunch of people you don't know. And so we won't spend a lot of time unpacking that, all right? Because we don't know who these people are either. All right, here we go. Romans chapter 13. And here's what Paul knows as he is writing chapters 12 and 13. He knows that he is writing to Christians in Rome. That's why the letter is called Romans. And Rome at the time was not the home of the Pope. It was not the most influential city in Christendom. It was not the seat of the largest Christian church in the world. Michelangelo had not yet shown up, had not yet painted the Sistine Chapel. In fact, there was no Vatican. There was no St. Peter's Basilica. Nobody even called Peter a saint back then. Rome was on the western edge of where the gospel of Jesus had reached. It was not the center of Christendom. It was on the far edges of where the gospel had reached, which just means that the church in Rome was really, really small. And Christianity was not powerful and it wasn't influential. It was a minor, itsy-bitsy, teeny, weeny minority movement. It wasn't even a movement yet in Rome. And so, in fact, in Rome, Christianity was still just considered to be a sect or an offshoot of Judaism. So it didn't even have its own identity yet. And therefore, to be a Christian in Rome meant that you were living in a place where the vast majority of citizens didn't even know a Christian, might not have even heard of Jesus, didn't know much about Jesus. And so in chapters 12 and 13, Paul is kind of concerned with this question. How does then the gospel teach us to live in and among the vast majority of the city that are non-Christians? How does it teach us to live in a culture that is predominantly not following Jesus in a way that displays the character of Jesus for those who don't know him. That was a hugely important thing to get settled if you lived in ancient Rome. It wasn't the Vatican yet. It wasn't even kind of like Wichita yet. I mean, to follow Jesus meant that you were in a vast minority of people. Now, it's pretty important to learn if you're living in Denver too, right? Because we live in a city that, culturally speaking, is far more like ancient Rome than it is like America's Bible Belt. We are far from the buckle of this proverbial belt. So how do you live as a follower of Jesus? How do you show off the character of Jesus in a city where the vast majority of our friends and neighbors don't know him, might not even know a Christian? If you know them, you might be the only Christian they know. That was the situation of the church in Rome, and it's our situation too. And so today, Paul is going to deal with a surprising way that we represent Jesus. And he's going to talk about how we relate to the governing authorities in our culture. How do you relate to the government in a city or in a country where the vast majority aren't following Jesus? And as he writes this, he knows that it's very, very easy for us to get caught up in countless arguments about and arguments with the government. Like, are politics ever a hot topic among Christian people? Do Christians ever get caught up in political debates? Is that wise? Is that unwise? Is it sometimes wise and sometimes not wise? It's a timely issue for us. And so what Paul is going to teach us today is he's going to teach us a general principle. We're going to call it a general principle because it's not the sum total of everything you can say about the government and how we relate to government, but it's kind of the default position. It's the place we should strive to be. It's the place we should be insofar as we can be. This is kind of the position you have to start from and work from. He's going to teach us a general principle, a starting point for how we relate to the government around us, especially if seizing the reins of power isn't an option, especially if Christianizing the government to do God's will is not an option for you. How do you, if you are a minority, how do you relate to the governing authorities that are around you? This is a question even the church in America is largely wrestling with today. At one point in our history, the cultural influence of Christianity was so strong that the values promoted by the government, the values promoted by the Bible kind of lined up. So it's kind of easy to be a Christian. And then things began to shift, and some have advocated that what we need to do is reclaim the reins of power and cultural influence. And that hadn't worked so well. So what do we do if we never have a Christianized culture again? How do we relate to the powers that be? Well, this was written to Christians living under a very imperfect government, the Roman Caesar and his governors. And so we're going to learn this alongside the Apostle Paul today. If you have a Bible open, start reading with me in Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. In fact, the general principle around which everything else revolves is just the first half of verse 1. We'll spend a little time there first. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There it is. That's our sermon. Let's go home. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now, to be subject to means more than just obey. Paul is really getting at an attitude here. He's getting at a disposition that's more than just obedience. It's a posture where you willingly, without complaining, you willingly live within the established order. So be subject to the governing authorities means something like don't resent those who are in authority over you. Live under them, even the imperfect, sometimes annoying ones. Now, let's be honest. Are any of you ever annoyed by the government? Okay. Now then you can go, which government are you annoyed by? Are you annoyed by the national government? It's sometimes annoying. Are you annoyed by the state government? Are you annoyed by the city government? Christians should be the least annoyed or provoked people in the city. Let's just take our city government, for example. It's fairly functional as city governments in our country go, and yet even a fairly functional city government like we are blessed with here can still sometimes create annoying, complicated webs of regulations. How many of you ever spent 10 minutes trying to decipher if you can or can't park here on a particular day, right? So it'll be like 2-hour parking Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., except the first Tuesday of the month, April through November. For what? Street sweeping. And what is street sweeping? It's where they come by with a big machine and they blow dust from the street into people's yards. And then they ticket people who haven't moved their cars. It's a giant money-making scheme called street sweeping days, right? Now, we should not be easily annoyed by things like this, because our default position is to be subject to the governing authorities, to live under them without complaint. Now, when you get into matters more serious than street sweeping, it raises all kinds of questions, doesn't that? I know it raises questions. Like, what if the authority is unjust? Well, we'll ask that question a little bit later. But for now, you've got to get the general principle down. You've got to get the posture down. Our attitude toward authority should be a desire to be subject to. This was written to Christians living under Caesar. And Paul surely knew the imperfections of Caesar. But that doesn't keep him from backing off the general principle. And now he's going to tell us why this is the general principle. Look at the second half of verse 1 and then verse 2. For, and because, I'm fixing to explain to you why I just said that. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For there's no authority except from God. Now, when he means there's authority from God, he means it comes from him, it is given to him, it is loaned by him to other people. So those who are in authority have been given their authority. They've been loaned their authority from God, who is the ultimate authority. We're dealing here with what is sometimes called God's sovereign will. And sovereignty is a concept drawn from the worlds of kings and kingdoms, very appropriate in this case. And so it was thought in the ancient world, it's thought even in the modern world, that a monarch has final approval over whatever happens in his or her kingdom. Now, this is an important nuance. Sovereignty doesn't mean that the king or the queen is the only one who makes any kind of decisions in the kingdom or queendom at all, because the king often does delegate secondary authority to people under him, but the king retains sovereignty. The king has final approval. Now, throughout Scripture, when it's talking about governing authorities, the governing authorities are depicted as not sovereign, but as secondary. God is the sovereign over governing authorities. They are secondary. We have one example of this in our Bible, a whole book called Daniel that really deals with people living under a ruler who thought he was sovereign, who really wasn't, because there was a God above him. And the whole story is about God proving to this ruler Nebuchadnezzar that he is not as sovereign as he thinks. When the book of Daniel was written, Israel had been conquered by this nation called Babylon. They were living under this hard-fisted dictator named Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar starts to think that he is the sovereign over his kingdom. And God uses this as an opportunity to teach him and to teach Israel and to teach us, by way of example, who's really sovereign. Let me show you a story of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 that illustrates this pretty well. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. Now, the royal palace was very likely the largest, the highest point in the city. It was built on the highest point. So to be walking on the roof of the royal palace means you are walking at the highest point in the city. You can look out and just survey the whole kingdom that he has conquered. So he's just taken stock of all that he's accomplished. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beast of the field. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. This man was made insane, made to live naked and eat grass and have his hair grow out, because God was proving to him that he ultimately wasn't in charge. God was demonstrating to him that the kingdoms of men are given by God. The Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills. Now, that's the same thing Paul is talking about when he tells us here in Romans 13, there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, here's an important nuance to get, lest you abuse this. God sovereignly giving authority to everyone in authority does not mean that God automatically approves of everything they use their power to do. So rulers and kings and congressmen and governors and dictators can't claim Romans 13 to justify everything they do as God's will that you have to obey without questioning it. Sometimes it's been used in that manner. But that's not what sovereignty means. He delegates to them the authority. He does not necessarily approve of everything they use their authority to do. In fact, the very lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned was, one, God had given him his authority, and two, God did not approve of the way he was using his authority, so he got deposed. So what are the governing authorities to do if they are doing what God does want them to do? What are they to do if they are using their authority in God, in the way that God designed their authority to be used? Well, verse 3 and 4 is an explanation of how good government works. So if you're in government, that's some of us, work for the government, this is God's desire for you. And if you're under the government, that's all of us, we're not under the government, we're under governments. Then this is what it should look like. This is how God designed it to work. Look at verse 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So a summary of everything the government is to be about is found there in verse 4. For he is God's servant for good. So government is designed by God to serve the good. In fact, it serves the good in two ways we hear in this passage. First of all, it serves the good by approving and commending what is good. So in verse 3, Paul says, would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what's good. You'll receive his approval. So the very first goal of every government should be to make sure that good is protected and rewarded. Government is there to serve and to promote the good and to reward the good and to say this is good and to approve what is good and to protect those who are doing good. Now, the second way government serves the good is by avenging evil and by restraining evil and hopefully by deterring evil. Look at verse 3 again. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad. So there's a good way that the government can be terrorizing. It can strike fear in those who are prone to doing evil in a way that brings unrest and destruction into our society. So rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad. And then look at verse 4. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. The sword is the government's power to punish. It probably includes the power to take life in response for someone else taking life. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Last week we learned that when others wrong you, we are instructed not to avenge the wrongs done to us, not to right the wrongs through violence or payback, or even by ongoing bitterness and gossip. But the government is authorized to right wrongs. The government is authorized to seek revenge. The government is authorized to retaliate and to return evil with punishment. In fact, the reason that we can be told not to do it is because the government is told to do it. so that even though we're told not to do it, we can be confident that God has still established a way for evil to be avenged. Now, all of this means that as long as you're in subjection to the government, as long as your posture is, I'm willing to live under and within these powers, you should have nothing to fear. In fact, you receive two gifts that Paul is going to unpack in verse 5. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath. That's one gift you receive. You don't get punishment from the government, which is God's avenger. So you avoid that. That's pretty good. Not getting punished, it's a good thing. So you must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. A clean conscience is another gift that you get. Have you ever had a nagging conscience on something that you're doing, or deep down, like, I shouldn't be doing it, or I'm not going about this in the way I should be going about this? And maybe you can even see the damage this is bringing, or the potential damage that it could bring. And then because the conscience isn't clean, when your conscience is nagging, then you have to work hard to do one of two things, and often we do them both. The first thing we do is we rationalize. We explain to ourselves why what we're doing isn't as bad as what it feels like we're doing. We rationalize why this is really okay, because if you just understood this and this and this, it's kind of okay. So we rationalize it. Or we cover our tracks to make sure no one is finding out. We look over our shoulder constantly. We explain things in a way that kind of doesn't let people see the full truth of what's going on, because if they knew, that it might not be good. Here's a simple one that some of us struggle with. You ever find yourself driving over the speed limit? Now, I'm not saying I do this, but I know many of you do this. Let's talk about your speeding problem. When you're speeding, your eyes are constantly alert for the presence of the police, aren't they? You just see any kind of white car on the horizon that might be a Ford, and you just start slowing down, right? You have to be extra wary of minivans parked along the side, because they might have cameras in them with people taking pictures of you and mailing you speeding tickets. I'm not saying I have any experience with this. There's always one, by the way, parked on Spear Boulevard near Cherry Creek, and also on 6th Avenue just before you get to Colorado Boulevard. So by coming to church today, you just saved $150. Now, when you're speeding, you're always worried about getting caught, aren't you? Now, here's what I hear. There are people who don't even have to think about that because they drive the speed limit. And by simply living contentedly within the arbitrary law that has been established, they get the gift of a clean conscience. Don't ever underestimate the power of a clean conscience. There's nothing more freeing than living with a clean conscience. So Paul says, therefore, one must be in subjection. Not only are you going to avoid a whooping, but also you're going to get a clean conscience. Now he's going to put it in even more practical terms. Verse 6. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Paul is coming from a tradition in Judaism that had a hard time paying taxes to foreign rulers. They were often resentful of taxes they had to pay. They often asked Jesus about this. Jesus, should we pay taxes? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? To which he's like, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And Paul says the same thing here. Pay to all what is owed to them. If you owe them taxes, pay them taxes. If you owe them respect or honor, give them respect or honor. So you represent Jesus well by being a tax paying, an income tax paying, a sales tax paying, a Social Security tax paying, a federal unemployment tax paying, a state unemployment tax paying, a personal property tax paying, a car tag tax paying, parking ticket paying, photo red light ticket paying, respectful citizen of Denver, of Colorado, of the United States. Now, why should you do this? Well, we have a similar teaching that Peter gives. In fact, what Paul is teaching us in Romans 13 is evidently something that was taught to all churches by all the apostles everywhere. Here is Peter writing something that's going to sound very, very familiar. This comes from 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution," for the Lord's sake, meaning for his name, for his reputation. So by being subject to the authorities, you are representing the Lord well. You're representing Jesus well. You're not disdaining or not smudging his name. You're making him look good. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it is to the emperor as supreme or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So you silence people who would criticize followers of Jesus. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so you represent Jesus well. You represent God well by honoring those whom God has put in authority. So that's the general principle. Be subject to the governing authorities. Now, some will say, now that can't be the whole story, can it? What about when the governing authorities are unjust? What about when they punish those who do good? What about when they command us to do things that God forbids? What about when they call good things that are evil and they call evil things that are good? If you live for long in a world like ours, you're going to deal with some of these dilemmas. So how does the general principle, be subject to the governing authorities, apply in those situations where the governing authorities don't seem very subjection to worthy? Would we even have advances in our society like the civil rights movement in our own nation's history if Christians had, and it should be said, if some Christians had simply accepted the law of the land as it was, unjust as it was, and just said, oh well, that's the unjust law of the land? We have examples from our own scriptures where a king commands something where God forbids of his people. Remember our friend Nebuchadnezzar? But before he learned that God was over him, he erected a golden image of himself to be worshipped. Daniel tells that story in Daniel chapter 3. Here's how it went. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits. I looked it up, it's really big. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the occasion, for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, John Mayer, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, for most citizens of ancient Babylon, that was no problem. This is what the governor had commanded. This was a good way to keep the peace. If we need to indulge Nebuchadnezzar's ego by worshiping a ginormous gold statue of him for a few minutes every day when the music plays, that's fine. But if you were Jewish, you knew that it was a direct violation of God's commandments to fall down and worship the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had erected. The first commandment that God had given his people was, "You shall have no other gods before me." The second commandment he had given them was, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that's in the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." So there are 3 Jewish boys who are serving in the king's court. Their name is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They work for Nebuchadnezzar, and they have a dilemma on their hands. To obey the governing authorities in this case would mean to disobey God. So what do? Well, if the choice is between obeying God or obeying the governor, you go with God. So they did. They refused to worship, and Nebuchadnezzar threw them into his fiery furnace, it turns out. Now here's what they said to him before getting thrown into the furnace. Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, even if he doesn't deliver us, even if he just lets us burn in the furnace, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now here we have established the principle of civil disobedience. Sometimes you can't obey what the government says because what the government says violates God's command. Sometimes you can't endorse laws that the government enacts because they contradict God's definition of justice, which is the only definition of justice that is justice. Sometimes you can't go along with the law of the land because it contradicts God's will and his command. And even if you can't go along, even if you can't endorse, even if you can't obey, you're still subject to the governing authorities in this way. You, in conscience, disobey, don't go along, refuse to enact, and you accept the punishment for disobedience. This is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They refused to bow down and worship, and they accepted what Nebuchadnezzar did. The civil rights movement in our own country used civil disobedience of unjust laws and nonviolent acceptance of the consequences to protest the injustices they were living under. So even in that way, they were still subject to the governing authorities, even though the governing authorities were evil. Now, why then can we live under imperfect authority? Why is the default be subject to the governing authorities, even the imperfect ones? Why can God even command that of his people, knowing that he's commanded us to live under Caesars? Well, let me show you two reasons for this. The first one comes from the death of Jesus. You may or may not know that when Jesus was put to death, that it was really the Jewish leaders, the Jewish authorities who wanted him crucified. But they did not have the authority in the governmental structure of the day. They did not have the authority to crucify Jesus. They could not execute capital punishment. That rested with the Roman government. And so there had to be, for Jesus to be crucified, there had to be some collusion between the Jewish authorities who wanted him crucified and the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. So they had to convince Pilate to put Jesus to death. As the story unfolds, it becomes pretty evident that Pontius Pilate can't find Jesus guilty of much of anything. In fact, he would prefer to have him released, and he'll release him if Jesus will just make a cogent defense of himself for why he isn't guilty of all they're accusing him of. But at one point, Pontius Pilate gets frustrated because Jesus refused to answer the charges. Jesus refused to defend himself. And here is how the exchange between Pilate and Jesus goes as Pilate is wrestling with this dilemma. Should I crucify this man or not? I don't think he's guilty. Why won't he just make a defense? Pilate, entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And that's true. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." And so Jesus just reminded Pilate of what God had taught Nebuchadnezzar, which is the same thing that Paul is teaching us in Romans 13. There's no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted from God. And you would have no authority over me if it had not been given you from above. Now, Pilate went on to use his authority to crucify Jesus. And so the first reason that God can even tell us to be in subjection to the governing authorities, even though they're imperfect, is that God used even an imperfect governing authority to accomplish his purposes with Jesus. In fact, he used the sentence of an unjust governor to bring your salvation about. And so if God uses unjust government to bring our salvation, he can command us for a little while to be in subjection to the governing authorities, even when they're imperfect. Now, here's a second reason that he can command this. And the second reason comes not from what he did in the past, but what he is going to do in the future. It comes from a promise that Jesus is fulfilling that hasn't been completely fulfilled yet, but will be fulfilled one day. This promise first shows up way back in the Old Testament when Israel is in exile, living under Babylon. And God promises that one day he's going to do something new through their Messiah, who turns out to be Jesus. So this promise first appears in the prophet Isaiah. Let me show you the first time it appears in Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah is looking into the future, anticipating something God's going to do. And he sees this. For to us a child is born and a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Now, when he says government, he means government. The government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. When he says prince, he's talking about a governing authority who brings peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. When he says government, he doesn't mean like some kind of spiritual thing. He means government on the earth. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So the second reason that God can command us for now to live under imperfect governing authorities is that one day he will establish a perfect government on earth when Jesus returns and reigns over God's kingdom. The government will belong to him. It will be a government of perfect peace. It will be a government of perfect justice. And of the increase of that government and of peace, there will never be an end. And so today, if you live under imperfect governors, you are testifying to two facts. You're testifying, one, to the fact that God used this imperfect government to accomplish our salvation. And you're testifying to the fact that God will one day do away with imperfect government and establish a perfectly righteous one on earth. And the majesty of the kingdom that is to come, where the Messiah will reign in peace over the earth, the majesty of that kingdom, the greatness of that kingdom is so wonderful, so long-lasting, so never-ending, so eternal, so glorious, that if you have to live under an imperfect government today, that's small potatoes compared to what is to come. And so as people who are followers of Jesus then, belonging to his kingdom doesn't mean that we have to get irritated at the imperfections of our government today. It doesn't mean we have to resist being under any other authority than Jesus, because God sometimes delegates his authority to those under him. But it means that we can, with an uncommon bearing with itness, with an uncommon peace, with an uncommon joy, we can be subject to the governing authorities because, one, God used them to accomplish our salvation, and two, he will one day do away with them and replace them with a perfect government. And when we live as contented, satisfied people in Denver, Colorado, though we might be a small minority, though we cannot seize the reins of power, we are testifying in doing that. We are testifying to one who is greater than the governor, the president, the congressman, the mayor, the police. We are testifying to one who is greater than that, who is God, and the coming reign of his son, Jesus. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would teach us in our lifestyles to witness to the reality of your kingdom and to the greatness of your Son. We learned last week that we should witness this in not being overcome by evil, but overcoming evil with good. And so I pray you would help us to do it in how we relate to our friends and to our neighbors and to each other. And this week, we're learning to do it as we relate to those who are in authority over us. And so I pray you'll help us to do that as it relates to the authorities. Not because they're always right, but because you are good and your kingdom is forever and you've accomplished our salvation. And so we thank you for our Savior Jesus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, dead and buried. And then on the third day, you raised him from the dead. And he ascended to heaven, where he sits at your right hand. And from there, he will come to judge the living and the dead, and of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. And so with that in mind, we read Paul's words, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And we look forward to the day when you will reign in peace on your earth. We thank you in Jesus' name and by his Spirit. Amen.